No, I did not mislabel the video you're seeing here. The 3060 is outperforming the 4060, but it usually doesn't. The 4060 is usually faster than the 3060 unless you're in a game that's using a lot of VRAM, or specifically more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, how different games sort of punish going beyond your VRAM buffer can be different, and a lot of games don't go past an 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, at least at reasonable settings for these cards. And are we even at reasonable settings right now? What we're going to look at in this video is I have revisited testing the RTX 3060 and the RTX 4060 in 10 newer games, but also at a variety of graphics settings. Because that's kind of the big question I still see people arguing over, is 8 gigabytes of VRAM obsolete or anything like that? And it's a bit more complicated than that. It's not so much that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is obsolete in modern games. It just means that in a lot of games you're going to have to be mindful of the graphic settings you use. And so that does kind of also ask the question, so would you rather have more power or more VRAM? It's kind of an interesting question, especially given the fact that at least if you're trying to buy these new right now, the RTX 4060, the lowest price models are $295, and the lowest price 3060s are, sometimes an 8 gigabyte version, so be careful of that. But the 12 gigabyte versions, the original 3060 that I'm looking at in this video, you can get them as low as $270, but sometimes $280. So the 3060 does cost a bit less, but only a bit less. That's interesting. Now, the graphic settings we were looking at here, where the 3060 ends up 5% ahead in the averages, but actually 21% ahead in the 1% lowest frame times, is Dragon Age the Veilguard at 1440p using DLSS quality, at ultra settings with selective RT settings turned on as well. Now, that's not the highest RT settings. The highest ones turns on all kinds of RT all the time and even has an ultra setting. So this is by no means the maxed out settings in the game. And I would say that the 3060 is, playable if you're not chasing the, higher refresh rate kind of experience. Now, personally, I would tune for more of a 60 FPS experience or better, rather than shooting for more of that kind of 40 FPS average. So again, are these really the settings you would use on this class of card? That's another thing that we want to think about, and that's why in this video, I didn't just test 10 games at max settings, I tested 10 games at a wide variety of settings, including upscaling on and off at 1440p. So let's go ahead and keep rolling, and I'll call out any interesting things that we're noticing here. For example, if I go down to 1080p ultra settings with selective RT, we're now seeing the 3060 even further ahead by 63% and almost doubling the performance in the lowest 1% of frames. Now, you'll really notice this on the frame time graph of the 4060. You'll start to notice it kind of spike up and down in certain scenes in a way that we don't get so much on the 3060, and that tends to be an issue when you're going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and we can see the card with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM is using more, and so again, that does seem to be causing the problem. However, if I just went to the 1440p ultra settings, now you might be like, wait, weren't we just at ultra settings? Well, now I've turned off ray tracing. You'll actually notice that now both cards are performing exactly the same. I'm getting 35 FPS on each and 29 FPS in the 1% lows. However, wait a minute, the 4060 should be faster. So because we are still trying to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, it's holding back the 4060 from its full potential. Because again, usually the 4060 would outperform the 3060. And now interesting here, when I enable DLSS quality, the 3060 is able to boost its performance more than where we were in that last scene, because again, it's not being held back by its VRAM. Whereas the 4060 starts to kind of choke and get these spikes in a slower overall frame rate once the VRAM buffer fills up, and it ends up, again, underperforming the 3060 fairly noticeably here, especially in the 1% lows. So again, it's kind of held back on having to reach into system memory, and it can't go faster than what that allows. Now, if we drop down to 1080p resolution at ultra settings, you can see that the 4060 is now averaging 50 FPS, while the 3060 is averaging 45. So you might be like, oh, okay, so at 1080p, we're fine at ultra settings. And the answer is actually still no, because if you look at the lowest 1% of frame times, the 3060 is ahead here by 16% at 36 versus 31. So there's still kind of some choking that happens right here as you fill up VRAM buffer and then have to spill into system memory. You can see that happen there. And the longer you play, this is only like a 1 minute or so little benchmark run, the longer you play, the more you can see that. Now, if we turn down graphic settings pretty considerably, and we're now down to medium settings, you can see that the 3060 is now not trying to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, even though it has it, and now performance is more where you would expect. The 4060 is 10% ahead at 57 FPS versus 52, and the lowest 1% of frames are still the 4060 leading, and this time by 17%, 48 versus 41. Now, we're still not averaging over 60 FPS, so I still think here you might want to turn on DLSS quality if you're on a 1440p display. And if we do that on medium settings, now both GPUs are very, very playable. Our frame rates would feel good in combat. And the 4060 is ahead here, and we have no signs of spilling over the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer. So 4060 is winning by 11% at 73 FPS versus 66. And the 4060 is ahead by 22% in the 1% lows at 62 versus 51. Now, let's go ahead and drop down to 1080p medium settings, where again the 4060 is winning. This is 80 FPS versus 72, winning by 11%, and 65 versus 55 in the 1% lows. So an 18% win for the 4060. So that kind of wraps up my Dragon Age Veilguard settings. So at medium settings, VRAM is not an issue. But is it just Dragon Age Veilguard? Well, another, fairly recent-ish, at least on PC game, is Final Fantasy 16. And this is another game that's trying to use a lot more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, at least when you're at the ultra settings. We can see that here. We can see these massive frame time spikes on the 8 gigabyte GPU. And this is at 1440p ultra settings, although using DLSS quality. And we do see the 3060 ahead, especially in the 1% lows. However, neither GPU is doing particularly well. If we drop down to 1080p resolution, we now see that I apparently have a typo, and I forgot to type in that the 4060 was faster by a certain percentage here, so I'll block it with my head. So the point is, 4060 is ahead on the averages, 42 versus 38 here. However, in the 1% lowest frame rates, the 3060 is ahead, and you can see spikes on the frame time graph for the 4060 at a pretty regular interval as it has to spill in new textures from the VRAM buffer. But what if we drop down to medium settings? That solved our problems in Dragon Age Veilguard. Well, it mostly solves our problems here. The 1% lows are still kind of close together here at 40 and 39, indicating the 4060 may be having some issues, although the 4060 is overall ahead in the average frame rates by 16% at 58 versus 50 frames per second. But if we drop down to medium settings at 1080p, we can notice these big frame time spikes happening on the 4060, indicating that there are issues going on here. And the 3060 is winning by 71% in the 1% lows. And again, this is at 1080p medium settings, where, in Dragon Age Veilguard, dropping down to medium settings, especially at 1080p, solved the VRAM issue. Now, the 4060 is still ahead by 10% here. And what's going on with these big frame time spikes? Well, I analyzed this closely, and I want you to look right here at this archway. Do you see it flickering and popping? Whereas on the 3060, that didn't happen. Here, let's play it again. This is zoomed in and slowed. The 3060 is totally stable here, whereas the 4060 is popping in and out. Now, this is just the one place where I had noticed that, but it probably is happening in other places too, where I just didn't happen to notice it during the recording. But that's because those textures are having to spill into system memory because they can't fit them all in VRAM, and that's when we were getting those big frame time spikes. So that's the other issue that can happen when you're spilling over your 8 gigabyte of VRAM buffer is texture popping issues, and sometimes that is also accompanied by performance issues, although at 1440p low settings, the 4060 is now pulling ahead, although neither GPU is performing particularly well here. So I went ahead and went all the way down to low settings and using DLSS quality, and neither GPU actually gets great performance here. It's kind of disappointing to say. We're still not hitting a 60 FPS average on either one. So Final Fantasy 16 appears to just be a really heavy game, even at low settings. And now we're having the characters pop in at, I'd say, unacceptably close distances and things like that. We're averaging mid-50s here, and there are easier to run sections of the game, but still. Anyway, at 1080p low settings, we're averaging 55 versus 50 with the 4060 in the lead. And the 1% lowest frames are 41 versus 35, 17% lead for the 4060. So, at least in this scene of this game at 1080p at low settings, which is pretty low, we're not having VRAM issues on the RTX 4060, so it does take the performance lead. Let's go ahead and move on to some other games. Now, Avatar Frontiers of Pandora at 1080p ultra settings, and this game does always include RT, was giving me some frame time spikes here on the 4060, which gave a small lead, well, not too small, but a lead in the 1% lowest frames to the 3060. However, that wasn't always happening. It wasn't always repeatable. So I think this is one of the games where, again, the VRAM buffer tries to intelligently just get rid of stuff if it can't hold it. If we look at 1440p Ultra, for example, the 4060 is actually more ahead than usual, 24% in the 1% lows and 20% on average. But my guess would be on close inspection, some of the textures maybe in the distance are probably not at as high of resolution on the 4060 as they are versus the 3060, and that this is one of the games that is just taking things out of the VRAM buffer to make sure it fits in and tries not to cause performance issues. Because you can see cards that have more VRAM are clearly allocating it, so they're caching more textures and things like that. Now that being said, in this side-by-side comparison, I couldn't actually see a visual difference, so this game does seem to be handling it pretty well. So there is that. Now, if we go down to medium settings, the game still tries to cache more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM on the 3060, but again, the performance numbers go up for both. I'm not visually seeing a difference here, so however the game is handling it, it does seem to handle it pretty gracefully here, at least compared to some of the other games we've looked at when you're spilling over the 8 gigabyte of VRAM. Now, if we go to 1440p DLSS quality at medium settings, our frame rates are now finally looking pretty playable at 68 versus 56, 21% lead for the 4060 here. The lowest 1% of frame times are a 22% lead for the 4060 at 56 versus 46. So overall, just very, very playable here at those settings. If we drop down to 1080p at medium settings, we're seeing a 68 versus 55 FPS average, 4060 leads by 24%, and a 1% lows difference of 25% advantage 4060. Again, the card with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM does try to fill it. Again, how necessary is that? Because I'm at least not spotting obvious differences in the textures between the two sides of the screen. I don't know, the game seems to handle it fairly well. Okay, what about Horizon Forbidden West? At 1440p very high settings, we start to get some spikes in the frame time graph as we transition right here, causing the 1% lows to dip and kind of little bits of stutter throughout gameplay. So the 1440p very high settings are definitely causing issues on the 8 gigabytes of VRAM, leading to a lead in the 1% lowest frame times for the 3060, because it has a smooth frame time graph, whereas the 4060 will sometimes get those little spikes. But if I jump ahead in my benchmark here to using DLSS quality, well, does that solve the problem? By lowering the internal rendering resolution, we might help a little bit, but we're still getting some frame time spikes that are very small, but they're there, leading to the 3060 still having better 1% lows, while the 4060 leads a little bit in the averages. Now, what if we jump ahead to 1080p resolution? Well, at very high settings, here I'm not seeing issues on the 4060 this time, and we're getting playable frame rates 66 versus 55. I will say under longer gameplay, I have noticed occasional spikes even at 1080p very high settings, but for the duration of this benchmark run, I wasn't able to catch those little blips in the frame time graph. Now, what if we go down to medium settings? Well, this clearly gets us within the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer. Even the card that has more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM is not trying to use it. And so now the 4060 just leads, and we're getting pretty playable frame rates even at a native 1440p resolution here at 64 versus 54. But you still might want to boost performance a bit using DLSS, so I tried that out as well. So 1440p medium settings with DLSS quality now gets us to 86 versus 71 FPS average. 1% lows are looking pretty good as well, and the 4060 takes the lead as expected since we're not trying to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. If we jump over to 1080p resolution at medium settings, again, good frame rates on both GPUs. We're at 91 versus 75. 1% lows are good at 77 versus 66, so let's move along. Here, I've tried out Silent Hill 2, which is an Unreal Engine 5 showcase, and this is one of the few that lets you turn on hardware-accelerated ray tracing. That's the hardware-based Lumen. But here we're not going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, although neither GPU can hold a 30 FPS average at 1440p maxed settings. Kicking on DLSS quality does get both GPUs to average over 30 FPS. We're now at 42 versus 35. And again, there's no indication that VRAM is an issue, not just because performance is giving the 4060 the lead, but again, even the card with more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM isn't trying to use it. So the one thing I will say for Unreal Engine 5 is that it does seem to be very efficient on VRAM usage in most games. I don't tend to see performance issues at reasonable settings on most GPUs. At 1080p maxed out settings, so Epic with the hardware ray tracing turned on, again, we're not seeing any VRAM related issues. The 4060 is taking the lead, but overall performance isn't great. Here we're at 40 average on the 4060 and only 34 on the 3060. So in both cases, you'd probably turn down graphic settings. So what might you do? Maybe turn off hardware accelerated ray tracing. I tried that at 1440p settings, and the 4060 can average 30, but 1% lows dip to 25. The 3060 is only averaging 25, 1% lows at 21. So not great there, so probably kick on at least DLSS quality. But still, our frame rates aren't amazing at 46 and 36 respectively. Big lead for the 4060, but still probably not the settings you'd want to actually play the game at. At 1080p resolution, at Epic settings, it's 43 versus 36. Similar performance at a native 1080p to what you get at DLSS quality upscaling at 1440p. So here I've tried going down to medium settings. At native rendering resolution, the GPUs still aren't doing great at about 40 and 36. So then I tried kicking on DLSS quality at medium settings, and we're getting 53 versus 47. So it's starting to get more playable, especially on the 4060. Still not amazing, though. At 1080p medium settings, we're doing pretty well on the 4060 at 57 FPS, 3060 hanging out at 49. Not great. I did try going all the way down to low settings. At 1440p native resolution low settings, the 4060 is hitting 58 FPS versus 50 on the 3060. So I also tried using DLSS quality. So if we use DLSS quality upscaling and the low settings, by the way, the low settings in this game still do look pretty good. We're hitting 75 FPS and 61 respectively. So now we're hitting that over 60 FPS average that a lot of people would be looking for. At 1080p low settings, we're also getting good frame rates now at 83 and 69 respectively. Nice. And again, we didn't see any VRAM issues at all in Silent Hill 2. Let's move on to another Unreal Engine 5 game. This is Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga, and once again, maxed out settings. In this game, the highest settings are called high. We're not seeing any signs of spilling over an 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, even on the card that has more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. We're staying at about 7.5. Which means the 4060 is ahead as expected, however, only at 30 FPS versus 26, and the 1% lows on both dip below 30. So 1440p high settings are a bit too much for both GPUs. If you enable DLSS quality at the high settings, we're now hitting 47 and 40 respectively, which in most games I would say probably isn't good enough. However, in this particular game, it's a lot of slowly walking and slowly solving puzzles. Consoles target 30 FPS for this game, so honestly, if you're on a variable refresh rate display, this level of performance might be fine. For the visual experience, this game is definitely more about the visuals. And the audio quite a bit as well. Anyway, so what if we went ahead and went down to 1080p high settings? We're at 43 and 37 respectively here. Again, no sign of VRAM issues. Again, this level of performance might be okay in this particular game, but I did think a lot of people might want to try reducing settings to get higher frame rates. If we go to medium settings, but back up to 1440p, we're now at 42 and 38 respectively. Not amazing performance. So then I tried kicking on DLSS quality at the medium settings at 1440p. Now we're around 60 FPS on both GPUs, 64 and 56 respectively, 14% lead to the 4060. And the 3060 is fine if you're on a variable refresh rate display, especially in this game. I think that performance is fine. At 1080p medium, we're again around 60. It's 59 versus 53. And once again, the 1080p native results are fairly close to the 1440p quality upscaling results. Let's move on to a different engine with the God of War Ragnarok. And here we're seeing that at 1440p ultra settings, there's no VRAM issues. We're actually staying under 7 gigabytes of VRAM, at least in this test scene I'm using here. But performance isn't great at 43 and 38 respectively. If we try kicking on DLSS quality on the ultra settings at 1440p, the 4060 is close to a 60 FPS average at 58, but you'll notice in a lot of scenes, depending on which direction you're looking, frame rates can still dip down into around 50 or even into the 40s. I've noticed in this scene, the frame rate's kind of all over the place, depending on which direction you're looking. That's one reason why I kept kind of running in circles and try to get some enemies on the scene for my benchmark pass and stuff like that. Anyway, here we went down to 1080p resolution ultra settings. It's 55 versus 48 respectively. Again, I'd probably be chasing higher frame rates on both GPUs. So I tried out medium settings. At native 1440p, that's hitting 54 and 51 FPS respectively. I still felt like that was a bit lower than I'd want in like an action style game. So I tried kicking on DLSS quality, and now we're at 78 and 67 respectively, 16% lead for the 4060. So now we're at pretty good performance on these on both GPUs, and again, VRAM is a non-issue on the 8GB card. At 1080p medium settings, we're hitting 76 and 65 FPS respectively, so doing pretty well here performance-wise as well. Moving on to Ghost of Tsushima. At least in the benchmark pass that I did, 1440p very high settings did not seem to be having issues with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. However, on a more extended gameplay, just playing around, I did occasionally see blips on the 8 gigabyte GPU, and it also struggled to enable frame generation, which used more VRAM. That's another thing I haven't really been mentioning or testing in this video. But overall, not usually an issue, and also kicking on DLSS quality at the very high settings helps rein in VRAM just a little bit more and also boosts frame rates to where I think we'll be happier at 69 nice versus 58, 19% lead for the 4060. At 1080p very high settings, we're hitting 68 and 57 respectively. So again, the 1080p native results very close to the 1440p quality upscaling results. And again, no signs of VRAM related issues here. I did also test out medium settings to see if you want to play at native 1440p, what kind of graphics compromise you'd have to take. Here we're hitting 64 and 59 respectively, so around that 60 FPS mark. Again, advantage 4060. At 1080p medium settings, you're getting a nice high frame rate experience with 94 versus 82. If we go ahead and check out Cyberpunk with a little bit of ray tracing, these GPUs are too weak for like the RT overdrive mode. If you're only going to turn, and even honestly, the Ultra RT mode is a bit too much. So here we're looking at Ultra settings with only one ray tracing effect turned on. And if I can only fit one into my performance budget, I'd probably choose the RT reflections in Cyberpunk, as it's very visually noticeable. Here, the 4060 is able to do about 61 FPS average in the built-in benchmark pass using DLSS quality upscaling at 1440p output. The 3060 hanging out at 52, which isn't amazing in a first-person shooter style game, but again, some signs that we're getting really close to the 8GB VRAM limit being an issue. So on either more extended gameplay, or if you tried to enable additional ray tracing effects, I think 8GB of VRAM could cause problems, but we weren't seeing it in this particular test pass. At 1080p resolution native, ultra baseline preset with just ray traced reflections turned on. We're seeing a 56 FPS average on the 4060 and 49 on the 3060. So interesting that the 1440p output with DLSS quality was actually performing a bit better than native 1080p. Now, 1440p quality upscaling is actually slightly below an internal rendering resolution of 1080p, so I guess that can make sense. Anyway, again, though, we are seeing the 3060 allocating a bit more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM, the actual per process usage staying under 8, and I'm not seeing performance issues here. We're definitely close to that 8 gigabyte limit, and again, I think additional ray tracing settings might kind of push that over the edge. And then also, if we then just try out, what if you're just playing esports type games, competitive games, you turn down graphic settings. So here we're looking at Call of Duty Black Ops 6, but playing at the basic settings. Here then we see that we're well under 8 gigabytes of VRAM. We're under 5 gigabytes of VRAM. And we're getting high-ish frame rates, 96 FPS on the 4060, 83 on the 3060. It's certainly playable. Although definitely I could see that people, into the competitive experience here might want to chase a higher frame rate, which we could do by kicking on DLSS quality. So that pushes up to 127 FPS on the 4060 and 107 on the 3060. And again, at the basic graphics settings, under 5 gigabytes of VRAM. But I think, again, in a lot of competitive games, people do turn down graphic settings to get that frame rate advantage. And also sometimes it kind of declutters your screen and makes it easier to visually parse where your enemies are at. If we go down to 1080p basic settings, we're at 141 FPS versus 115. Again, 23% advantage to the 4060 and not seeing any VRAM-related issues. And I think that's the last game I tested out here. It is. So let me pop out for some final thoughts on this. I'll also mention that I'm planning on uploading the full, just like unedited and unskipped benchmark pass here. It was really long. It was like 40 minutes of benchmarks. So in this video, I was kind of skipping ahead when I ran out of things to say, but if you wanted to see the just total benchmark pass, all 40 minutes, I think I'll upload it to my members feed, just not to try to paywall stuff, but just to make something additional available for people who click the join button to directly support the channel financially, and a huge thank you to those who do. But anyway, final thoughts on this comparison. Would you rather have, more VRAM or more performance? Well, I think in the vast majority of tests, we saw that the 4060 was providing the better experience. There were definitely situations where the 8 gigabytes of VRAM was obviously causing problems with stutters or textures not loading in properly. Oftentimes it was at graphic settings that you'd probably not want to use anyway, although not always. Sometimes it was at settings that might have been usable. And also I've seen this issue coming up in other games, like Indiana Jones and the Great Circle launched while I was making this video, didn't have time to fit it into testing. But I've seen with like Digital Foundry's coverage, that's a game where, again, it's not too hard to run, but if you have a low VRAM amount, you're going to have to turn down things like textures and all that. So is 8 gigabytes of VRAM obsolete? No. But are you having to turn down settings in a lot of more recent games? Yes. Would I still rather have more power than more VRAM? I think on average, it's a better experience. Especially if you're somebody who's mostly playing competitive games, and especially if you're somebody who not just plays competitive games, but turns down graphic settings to get a competitive edge. And that's what we see in the Call of Duty Black Ops 6 type testing here at basic settings. But my real final thoughts are, it'd be nice if we didn't have to choose, right? More VRAM or more performance. It would be nice if a generational uplift provided more performance and either the same VRAM or more VRAM. Whereas the 3060 to 4060 jump in retrospective here as we get to the end of the 4060's life, and next year we'll probably get a 5060, it was a bad look to reduce the VRAM capacity generationally. And so I'm really hoping that as we go into the 50 series with the 5060, that they find some way of giving us at least 12 gigabytes of VRAM. And if you're interested in a card with 12 gigabytes of VRAM at a lower pricing tier, most of this testing was performed to get up-to-date results to compare with the ARC B580, and expect my test on that coming out later this week when the review embargo lifts. I'm still testing out the B580. I couldn't tell you about my thoughts on it yet anyway, due to review embargo, but anyway, keep your eye out for that. And hopefully this was fun to take a look at the 3060 and the 4060 and some newer titles and how they hang up, how they compare, especially like I said, at different graphic settings, because it seems like you can pretty much always reduce graphic settings to a point where the 8 gigabytes of VRAM isn't an issue and you can get reasonable performance on the 4060. It's just annoying that you have to think about that. And I also think a lot of users are going to be less knowledgeable about which graphic settings are VRAM heavy, so maybe you're having to turn down more stuff than you really needed to, or maybe you don't even understand that VRAM is the problem. Anyway, it's frustrating. I really hope we get at least 12 gigabytes of VRAM on the 5060, but maybe I'm hoping for too much from NVIDIA. We'll see. But I do hope you guys found this video useful and or interesting, and that you all have an excellent day.